This presentation will cover information specifically about in-text citations and reference lists that use the American Psychological Association style. I want you to recognize APA style in your research papers and particularly in your thesis proposal, and recognize how to actually write sources in APA style for a reference page that is included in your thesis proposal. We most importantly use APA style to ensure that we do not commit plagiarism. We want to give credit to others' ideas. A reader is more likely to believe an argument or a statement if it's followed by a citation that can be verified, so that it's not misinterpreted as your opinion. Using the most current sources is important in your discipline, like social and behavioral sciences and family and consumer science, extension education, or agricultural education, because new findings can make previous studies less relevant or accurate. And generally, the past 5 years is a good cutoff date when searching for information. Personal communication is considered to be letters, memos, emails, personal interviews, or telephone conversations you have with a source. Since this information is not considered recoverable because the readers of your document will not be able to access them, you do not include personal communication in your reference list. But if you do talk to a statistician about methodology or a statistical procedure, you could cite that personal communication in the text using only the source's name and the phrase personal communication and then the full date, meaning the month, the day, and the year that you had that communication. This is a great example on the slide for when to use personal communication. I also want you to make sure you understand that you cite your sources to build your credibility and avoid your plagiarism. And anytime you directly use material word for word from any source, you have to place those words in quotation marks and then cite that source. However, it's more common, especially when writing your thesis and your thesis proposal, that you paraphrase your ideas and you put it in your own words, but you still give credit to the source where you got those ideas. Paraphrasing is more than just changing one or two words, or just moving words around in a sentence, or changing tenses of a verb, or right-clicking to find synonyms. You actually need to take the text, read it, and put it in your own words so that you're not plagiarizing. You could summarize or just explain an overall main idea that comes from an entire document, but you still need to give credit to that source. And when you take several ideas from different sources and you're comparing and contrasting them, you're actually synthesizing the information. This is an important component when writing your literature review because you're going to look for multiple sources and combine like items from previous studies as well as theoretical framework to be able to discuss your topic. And you can cite more than one source in a sentence. And if that citation is parenthetical, you need to separate the sources with a semicolon and then arrange them in the alphabetical order of the first author's last name. When you do use a quotation, we have rules for how you actually display those in your document. If you have a quote that is 40 words or less, you can incorporate that quote into the body text and just enclose it in the double quotation marks. So you would say, according to Rogers, parentheses, 1967, the diffusion theory was first implemented when studying the adoption of a hybrid corn in Iowa. And you would have it all like a big long quote about it. And then after that quote, the parentheses with the page number from the book that you found that quote. But if you have longer quotations, meaning quotes that are longer than 40 words, you actually have to get a separate space for it. So you need to hit enter, create a new paragraph, indent that to 1/2 inch from the left margin. You don't single space, you omit the quotation marks, but you still got to include a page number at the end of the sentence. And this is an example on this slide of how you could do a long quotation. Perez anticipates shifts in training, colon. Then the next few sentences are the long quote. The great challenge for most school districts is to earmark sufficient funds for training personnel, not for purchasing or upgrading software. The technological revolution in the average classroom will depend on the large degree on innovation and professional development. And you'll see right at the end you have the page number. Because you had the author and the year at the beginning of the sentence, you only include the page number at the end, and that page number has to go inside of the period for the sentence. Now, as you read your research, you're going to notice if the citations in the text are actually APA format. And as you read your sources that are in APA, you're going to pick up on the style and how to use it in your own writing. So let's talk about what APA citations in text look like. When you cite your sources, you can either cite them in a sentence or at the end of a sentence. And generally, the best way to integrate your sources into your writing is to introduce them with a signal phrase. And a signal phrase lets your reader know that the following information is coming from that source. So as Jones, 2013, noted, Jones, 2013, found, according to Jones, 2013. All of those indicate to the reader that that author, Jones, is the source of the information that's coming up in your sentence. And you'll notice that there's a number of words that you can use here: argued, asserted, claimed, confirmed, contended, emphasized, noted, observed, pointed out, reported, suggested, wrote. So you have a little bit of a sentence variety, but do note that you're using past tense verbs. Jones noted, Jones found, according to Jones, the APA style is. You write in the past tense because all of that research has already been conducted in 2013. It's not current, it's not present. So it's all in past tense. You want to take note of that when you think about ways to use those signal phrases. Sources can also be cited parenthetically at the end of a sentence. And that period will go outside the parentheses at the end of the sentence. And so this is a great way to introduce statistics, facts, definitions. You'll notice here approximately 78% of all statistics are made up. Then you have the end of the quote, you have your parenthetical citation of Smith, O'Doul, and Jones, comma, 2013, period. And that's a great example of how you can do the parenthetical citation at the end of your sentence. But if you have sources with 1 to 5 authors, you got to list all those authors the very first time you cite the source. And then for 3 to 5 authors, all of your subsequent citations are going to be like Smith and al. And it just abbreviates them so you're not being repetitive in your writing. It's all about conciseness, clarity. And then if you have 6 or more authors, your citation's always going to be a first author and then et al. Just because of writing so many authors' names, it can really bog down the content of what you're trying to present to the readers. If you do use someone else's work, just make sure you give them credit. Here's an example of how to give credit to one author in an in-text citation. I've provided a few different examples here for what you could use. If you have 2 authors or 3 to 5 authors, I'm just reiterating the rules for you. With 2 authors, you always include both authors' last names, and you have to separate them with an ampersand in a parenthetical citation, and then in the text you actually have to use the word and. So right here is a parenthetical citation, Chun and Lee, 2001. and you would use the ampersand in this situation. But if you're writing a sentence like Nackosteen and Zimmer investigated how earnings affect spousal selection, it's appropriate to use the and written out and just the year in the parentheses after that second author's last name. And then for 3 to 5 authors, it's for the first citation, you include all of the names separated by commas, and then and in the text, or an ampersand sign in the parentheses. This is a table from the APA manual that illustrates how citations work, both inside the sentences and at the end of the sentences. A mistake students frequently make is only listing the first author they see in an article rather than actually checking to see if there are additional authors. Make sure you are following the style on how to cite each number of authors. Notice that this table does not discuss what to do if you do not know who the author is. That needs to be looked into further in the APA manual. Now here are going to be some examples of the most commonly cited sources in APA. We're looking at scholarly journals, books, websites with an organization as an author, a website with no author. And your job as a researcher is to use reliable in-text citations that direct your readers to your reference list. And all of your references should give your readers enough information that then the readers can actually find those sources themselves and be able to cite those sources. You never ever want to do second citations where you're just taking the word of an author, rephrasing it and looking at it, because what if they got it wrong? What if they didn't do their homework and make sure they were very clear and accurate in how they reported their information? So you want to develop a strong reference list, and your reference list only includes the sources that you actually cite in your paper. It is not a bibliography that could include any sources. So let's talk first a little bit about what a reference list looks like. You always start a reference list on a new page, and the word references should appear in upper and lowercase letters and centered across the page. And you want to double space all your reference entries in APA style. And APA actually publishes their references in a hanging indent format, which just means that the first line of each reference is set flush left and all the subsequent lines are indented. And the American Psychological Association's manual can show you some examples of documents that follow that style, but you could also search the USU library for theses and dissertations that follow APA style to see how a reference list looks. The pattern here for a journal article is always the author's last name and then an initial. So we got Fairman, comma, J, period, A, period. And you'll notice there is a space between initials. You do not have them butt right up against the period. Then you always do a publication year. For a journal article, it's only the year. Then when citing your author's, the article title, only the first word and proper nouns are actually capitalized. And then if you have a first word after a colon or an M dash, you can capitalize that word. So an example here is broadening the scope of nursing practice. That's all lowercase except for the word broadening. And then you're going to see the is dropped if it's at the beginning of the journal title often. Notice here that you have your italicized journal title, New England Journal of Medicine. It's italicized, and the volume number is always italicized. Many a times you're also going to include an issue if that journal has issues, like you have one volume and maybe it publishes 4 times or 10 times during that year, you'll want the issue. And then lastly, the page numbers. And then, of course, the DOI. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that identifier and how to find it and how to use it. This text is an example of a listing of all three authors, the first name, and then using the author and all thereafter. And just note that if you introduce the word with an abbreviation, such as nurse practitioner, you immediately have to follow it with the abbreviation in parentheses. So you'll see state regulations limit the extent to which nurse practitioners, parentheses, NPs, can exercise their skills and knowledge. Once you've given that abbreviation, then you don't have to spell out the word nurse practitioners again. Have you noticed that a lot of references and most of the recently published journal articles end with a string of numbers and letters? Well, those odd-looking items is the article's digital object identifier, or DOI. And it might just be the most important part of a reference. That DOI is like a digital fingerprint. Each article receives a unique one-time DOI that's used to identify that article throughout its lifespan, no matter where it goes on the internet, published by different journals or different publishers. And it was developed by a group of international publishers, the DOI system, and it provides a way to guarantee that digital copies of articles can remain accessible even if a journal changes its domain name or ceases publication. And so DOIs are assigned and maintained by registration agencies such as Crossref, and they provide citation linking services for different scientific publishers. APA does require you to use a DOI when you're referencing journal articles that you've accessed online. So DOIs are formatted according to Crossref. And again, it's a unique digit, and they've recently changed their format in March 2017 to a more user-friendly one that uses a URL address. And so you have http://dx.doi.org/, and then the rest of that is going to be the 4 or more digits assigned to that journal article. And it's just to ensure that resolves actually into a working link rather than just a number that could be lost on the internet because it doesn't include the URL address. And many publishers are still implementing these new guidelines. So either old or new DOI format is acceptable right now in APA style, but you never want to mesh the two styles together. So I have two examples for you. You can have either DOI : with the code, or HTTP : and then the code using the URL address. It's incorrect to mix them. So if you look here, there's a few different ways that you can do so. And just be really careful. If I make any suggestion, it's to go into that journal article, copy it, paste it, and then edit it in Word to make sure it follows APA style. And then you're not worried about missing any digits or slashes or periods in the assigned number. Now, if you're not sure where to find a DOI, I encourage you to look in the database searches that are available in the Utah State University's library system. And this is just an example where you can see the DOI physically available here. And you can just copy that and put that into the citation. They're still using the older format in this situation. But you can also find the DOI on the articles themselves, and they're at different places depending on how the journal is laid out. So these are just two examples of where you might find a DOI on a document, and it really is your responsibility to make sure that you've done your due diligence in finding that DOI and looking for it and completing your reference so it's as accurate as possible. But if for some reason you can't find it, you could use crossref.org and find the DOI for an article. What it does is allow for a free DOI lookup. So you type in your author, your journal title, the article title, the volume, the issue, any information you can absolutely find about this source. And then what it will do is search for it, and it will provide a DOI if one's been assigned to that article. And then, of course, if you're using sources like Info World, you could just access it by downloading the PDF file, because when you look at the website page here, you have the journal, you have the authors, you have the title, you have an abstract, you have keywords, but you don't have anything else. Well, what you got to do is download the PDF of the journal article. Then once you actually look at that PDF, you'll most likely find the DOI there. So what happens if you can't find a DOI? Well, the good news is not all journals have DOIs. For example, I publish in the Journal of Applied Communications. It's specifically targeting researchers and professionals who are agricultural communicators. And our journal doesn't have a DOI. It's a website that publishes every issue online and makes all the articles available to download as PDFs. So what you would do is go to your APA publication manual, and you'll look for a reference for an online journal article without a DOI. And what you'll notice is different. Instead of a DOI number, you'll actually use this phrase, retrieved from, and then you just copy and paste the URL address from where you got the journal article. You do not need to give the specific URL address of that journal article, because a lot of times it leads to a PDF. What you can do is send it to the main homepage for that journal. So for the Nonpartisan Education Review, the main homepage is right here on the screen, npe.ednews.org. And if you send them there, then they can go through the search and find the journal. That's really important, because what if the RUB designer changes the location of the journal, but it's still within that site? If you want to know a little bit more about using a DOI, I've provided to you a few tutorials. We have a DOI primer that's from the APA Style blog. This APA Style blog also did a tutorial on how to find DOIs if you happen to search for journal articles and psych info. There's also a really great flow chart that you can download here that shows you when to use a DOI and when to use the URL address. And if you can answer these questions, it really helps you figure out what you have to do for your flow chart and deciding, do I need to know what a DOI is, or can I go ahead and use the URL address? Now let's jump back into some of the other types of citations you'll have in your work. You may find conference proceedings to be a really great place for information. Not all conference papers get published into journals, but in our disciplines of extension education, family consumer science education, and agricultural communications, we could find some excellent conference proceedings at our main associations conferences. And so that's one place you can go to retrieve information. And what I did here was show you an actual citation and then a sentence that cites that source, so you can see how the two relate. It's not very different from a journal article. What you'll notice is the big differences would be that we include the word proceedings of a Western AAAE research conference in place of a journal title. We'll still include the page numbers, we just format them differently. And then we usually have to give a retrieve date, retrieval URL address, just because they're accessible online a lot of times, but not with a DOI that's assigned to it. You may also find a conference poster is a great source of information that if you're attending conferences, they're going to be very timely, and that could be beneficial for you as you're writing your master's thesis proposal. So here's an example of a conference poster, and I just caught something that I want to correct. Instead of saying poster or paper, I have to say poster presented at the Southern Association. And so that will help you understand that you do last name author, first initial, last name author, first initial. And then conference posters are interesting. We actually use the year and the month. Then we do our title, social agriculture. And you'll notice this colon, then the first letter, adoption, is allowed to be capitalized, but the rest of it isn't. So we have of social media by agricultural editors and broadcasters, all lowercase. And then we do poster presented at the Southern Association of Agricultural Scientists Conference. And we'll give the location, Orlando, Florida, and we'll say retrieved from, and we give a URL address. This would be helpful for research for agricultural education, extension education, or agricultural communications. And then here's a citation of how that source was used in the text. You might cite a periodical. Sometimes it's a very trendy, timely topic that's in the news that we're researching as social scientists. And so you might find a great piece of information from a newspaper. And it's okay to cite that occasionally. And this is one example of how you would do that by including the journalist's name, last name, comma, first initial, then the actual date. So you have to know the date that that article was printed. You give it the month, the day, and the year. You would have the title of the article, the newspaper it was published in, and then how you can find it. And usually it's going to have to be a URL address that you can just copy and paste into the entry. We also use a lot of books. I find that in agricultural communications, many of my theoretical frameworks will start off in the textbook. I go to the leading person who created that theory, and then I will build onto journal articles that have used that theory and have applied it to the topic that I'm studying. And so you may need to cite a book, and here is one example of what you do. It shows lock, comma, R period, D period, then the year the book was published. You have the title, then edition number, because, you know, 5th edition, 6th edition, 7th edition. Then you do your city, comma, the state, and then parentheses with the publisher's name. And there are certain cities that are so well known you actually don't use the state abbreviation for it. And these abbreviations are not always the same as postal code abbreviation, so I always check the APA manual to make sure I don't make a mistake, for I have seen them presented in different ways that are incorrect. We can also use websites as sources of information, and so this is one way that you can cite a website when you know that the organization itself is the author of the information, like the National Institute of Medical Health. And what you do is you provide the publication date. If you don't see a publication date, look for the copyright date when it was last updated. So for this website, it was last updated 2012. But you might find a more recent date if you just look at the footer and see when it was last modified. Then you'll use the title of the web page. So the title of this web page was Bipolar Disorders in Adults, and then you give the retrieval URL address from where you got that information. And this is an example here showing you how you can use this source in the body copy. I think what's really great is if an organization does have an acronym, you can actually abbreviate it in parentheses after spelling it out on the first time. And that does work for parenthetical citations. And then you never have to worry about writing it out afterwards. If you have a website with no author, you're going to treat this a little bit differently. You can start with the title of the web page, then the publication year. And again, that can be the date it was last updated, and you only need the year. And then retrieve from, and you give the URL address for that website. And you'll notice that when you cite that source in a parenthetical citation, the title of the article just goes in little quotation marks, and you only abbreviate it to maybe 1 or 2 words. So here they just said frequently asked. You could use the word frequently. It just really depends on your titles. And if you happen to have a website that has the same starting word, but that's not very common. So this would be an appropriate way to share that information. You can also make sure that you write your APA references when information is missing, and that does happen when you can't find all of your information. So this is just a note from the textbook on how you can write a source when something's missing. One thing that they might do is use like N period, D period when a date is missing for a publication. They may also show what to do for like retrieval information and deciding if you use retrieve from or retrieve and then the DOI address for it. I do a lot of research with video and looking at social media. And sometimes there is a really good news story or a blog post that you want to cite because of the relevancy to your topic. And this is just an example of a video blog post. You can use the person who actually posted the video or their username. And then if you got both, you want to include them. You'll see the date, the year, all the information, and then you can see how it's cited. If you have any questions or comments about this lesson, please contact me through Canvas inbox, and I look forward to working with you on the writing process of your master's thesis proposal.